Beyond Binary: Genderqueer as Critical Gender Kind by Robin Dembroff. 1. Introduction. Dissatisfaction with a strict binary gender system is nothing new, nor is the creation of language, modes of expression, or body modifications aimed at transgressing this binary. What is new are widespread and legitimized conversations surrounding this dissatisfaction. In just the last 10 years, web searches for genderqueer and non-binary have grown by a magnitude of at least 10 times. Merriam-Webster's dictionary added both terms. The Associated Press style book embraces they as a singular gender-neutral pronoun, and highly visible popular publications such as Teen Vogue and New York Times have run articles exploring the concept of identifying outside the gender binary. This is not to mention that multiple U.S. states now offer non-binary gender markers on government identification, with ever more municipalities and states following suit. Despite this public attention, non-binary gender identities have been an afterthought within philosophy of gender, and especially metaphysical discussions of gender. The central phenomenon under which consideration has been the binary genders, men and women. Narrowing the target phenomenon in this way has generated two problems, one metaphysical and the other political. First, by overlooking non-binary identities, existing metaphysical approaches to gender are insufficient for capturing persons who reject exclusive categorization as either men or women. This creates a gap of metaphysical explanation and understanding. For example, what is the relationship between gender-neutral language and being non-binary, or between androgyny and being non-binary? What, if anything, unifies the vast variety of non-binary identifications? Is there anything more to being non-binary than calling oneself by a non-binary label? These questions are metaphysically significant, but the theories on offer provide no answers. Second, without the resources for understanding non-binary identities, we sustain a conceptual lacuna surrounding non-binary persons. This lacuna does not only reflect a gap in philosophical understanding, it contributes to a hermeneutical injustice that arises from the failure to spread and charitably analyze the concepts and practices underlying non-binary classifications. In the wake of this conceptual silence, misunderstandings, both blatant and subtle, arise in droves, misunderstandings that undermine recognition and respect of non-binary persons. These two problems can be ameliorated by an account of genderqueer as what I call a critical gender kind, or a kind whose members enact resistance against dominant gender ideology. Genderqueer, on my proposed model, is a category whose members collectively resist the binary assumption, or the assumption that the only possible genders are the exclusive and exhaustive kinds, men and women, and do so based on felt or desired gender categorization that conflicts with this binary. I unpack this proposal in section 4. My model has many implications and no doubt will inspire as many worries. Like most philosophical theories, mine is probably wrong, but I believe it is closer to the truth than analytic philosophers have come so far, if only because we have had little to say about non-binary identifications. What's more, it is clear that this theorizing is overdue. Even empirical social research on trans identities frequently lumps together trans-binary and genderqueer persons, making it difficult to use this data to explain why, for example, genderqueer persons overall face heightened discrimination and psychological distress compared to trans-binary persons, and also differ with respect to attitudes towards medical interventions such as hormone therapy. If I am right, or even close to it, this heterogeneity should come as no surprise, since genderqueer conjoins persons who are extremely diverse across self-understanding and gender presentation, among other things. 2. Terminology and methodology. Genderqueer was first coined in the 1990s by trans activist Ricky Wilkins in an attempt to describe those who were both queer with respect to their sexuality and the kind of gender trash society rejected with respect to their gender intelligibility in public spaces. Since then, use has shifted away from mere description towards identity. In particular, it often functions as an umbrella term for a range of gender identities outside of the binary. I will use the term in keeping with this recent shift, but my primary concern is not with articulating the true meaning of genderqueer, but rather with articulating a gender phenomenon that has been ignored in analytic philosophy. My analysis relies heavily on personal testimony from genderqueer persons. This is not only because there is a scant amount of academic research about genderqueer persons, but also because I share the familiar feminist commitment to begin theorizing from the perspective of the marginalized. That said, I distinguish between two kinds of testimony. The first concerns genderqueer individuals' intuitions about paradigm or uncontested examples of persons who do not identify exclusively as men or as women. The second concerns these individuals' views about metaphysical questions concerning what, more generally, it means to be genderqueer. I rely on the first kind of testimony and not the second. Substantive metaphysical questions about genderqueer deserve careful analysis in just the same way that women and men have been given careful metaphysical analysis. In this, I follow Betcher in relying on persons' first-person authority over their own gender, while simultaneously allowing for substantive disagreement about the conditions for kind membership. My central concern, in other words, is not individuals' experiences, but rather the larger concepts that frame genderqueer identity. In particular, the concepts that structure commonality among the language, aesthetic expressions, values, and actions found among those who, within contemporary Western societies, identify as neither solely male or female. Notably, I am not primarily concerned with how genderqueers are understood within dominant contexts, which typically have no or a distorted understanding of non-binary persons. Rather, I focus on the practices and concepts surrounding genderqueer within trans-friendly communities, and especially by genderqueers themselves. Here again, I follow Betcher, who argues that assuming dominant gender meanings and concepts is a bad place to start feminist theorizing, as it effectively yields political ground from the very beginning. Finally, and relatedly, throughout this paper, I refer to genderqueer as a gender kind. My reader might wonder why I do so. Why take genderqueer to be a gender kind rather than some or other sort of social kind? I cannot offer a complete argument for my answer here. The abbreviated argument, however, is that, along with Elizabeth Barnes, I do not think that we should approach the metaphysics of gender by looking for kinds that correspond one-to-one with the gender terms we use to describe individuals. The terminological taxonomy of gender classification need not, and I think does not, align with the most useful metaphysical taxonomy of gender kinds. Rather, I approach the project of metaphysical inquiry into gender kinds as the project of inquiring into the kinds that reinforce or resist hierarchical, male-dominant social systems. Genderqueer, as I'll argue in what follows, is one such kind. For this reason, while I incorporate testimony from those who do use the label genderqueer, I do not take it that the kind I call genderqueer is one that contains all and only those who identify themselves using the label genderqueer. My focus rather is on using this testimony and other evidence to get a clearer picture of what, if anything, best characterizes the group of persons who do not exclusively identify as men or as women. First attempts. Within popular culture, most proposed definitions of genderqueer fall into one of two camps. On one approach, someone is genderqueer because they have certain external features, typically because they are androgynous, gender fluid, or otherwise violate gender norms. On another approach, someone is genderqueer because of a particular internal feature, namely self-identification, leaving open what exactly it might mean to identify outside of the binary. It is instructive to note that most available metaphysical analyses of gender also take one of these two approaches. On externalist approaches, someone's gender is determined by social factors that are external to them. For example, being perceived as androgynous or otherwise gender nonconforming. In contrast, internalist approaches focus on articulating more concretely what it means to identify with a particular gender. On these accounts, someone's gender is determined not by how they are perceived by others, but rather by what internal features, for example, self-understanding, behavioral dispositions, constitute their gender identity. I argue that neither an externalist nor internalist approach will provide a satisfactory account of genderqueer. Both misclassify paradigm cases of genderqueer and non-genderqueer individuals. Examining closely why this is the case is instructive. Not only will it clear the ground for my own proposal, but it also provides an opportunity to examine these paradigm cases, as well as genderqueer persons' testimony concerning their own identities. Such testimony illuminates not only why externalist and internalist approaches fall short, but also why genderqueer is best understood as a critical gender category. 3.1 An externalist approach. External theories of gender, sometimes also called social position theories, focus on gender as a social structure that advantages or disadvantages individuals according to the collective norms, expectations, and stereotypes surrounding the features that an individual is perceived to have. Externalist theories have been proposed or defended by Haslinger, Barnes, Witt, and Asta, among others. There are many potential ways to spell out what external social factors determine an individual's gender. For my purpose, the details of various externalist accounts is not centrally important. What is important, rather, is to see a trend among all of them, namely that membership in a given gender kind is based solely on factors that are external to any given individual. For example, social roles, perception, or treatment. In light of this, what would be the best externalist approach to genderqueer? Whatever it is, it must highlight only features that are external to genderqueer persons, while also capturing paradigm cases of those identifying outside the binary, as these persons are understood within trans-friendly communities. The most common, and I think plausible, externalist approach to genderqueer focuses on someone's perceived relation to gender norms and roles, and especially to masculine and feminine gender presentation. Indeed, a brief foray into popular media might suggest that someone is genderqueer because they do things that are outside the norm of their actual or perceived gender identity, or because they express a combination of masculinity and femininity, or neither, in their gender expression. A similar idea is echoed by popular articles, books, and visual media that equivocate between or constantly associate being non-binary with androgyny or gender nonconformity. Admittedly, this thinking is reinforced by the observation that many genderqueers fit this description. It is common for persons who identify outside the binary to adopt an aesthetic that defies gender expectations, often one that is androgynous or is fluid between masculine and feminine elements. Add to this that other behaviors often associated with non-binary persons also break gender norms, such as using gender-neutral pronouns or refusing classification as either straight or gay. With these considerations, it might seem that the best way to analyze genderqueer will be something like the following. Genderqueer externalist. Genderqueer is the category of persons who either 1. Are reliably perceived as attempting to not exclusively adopt either a feminized or masculinized gender expression, or 2. Cannot be reliably coded as having either a male or a female body. In other words, on this proposal, someone is genderqueer in a context just in case they either are perceived as transgressing binary norms of gender expression, for example, by adopting a gender fluid or agender aesthetic, or their body is perceived as androgynous, where this is understood as one's body being unreadable as male or female. Despite the many merits of this approach, I think it falls short of a successful account genderqueer. Examining why sheds light on why I think any externalist approach will be dissatisfactory. While many genderqueers do meet the above proposed condition, 2 further things are true. First, these persons often describe their androgyny or rejection of traditional gender aesthetic norms as an expression, but not the totality of being genderqueer, emphasizing in addition an emotional or political orientation towards the gender binary. When asked to describe their experience of being genderqueer, in fact, there is repeated and explicit rejection of the idea that being genderqueer is solely based on gender presentation or on others' perceptions. In their article, "This is What Gender Non-Binary People Look Like," trans activist Meredith Toulousan asked genderqueer persons to describe their experience of identifying outside of the gender binary. While answers varied in their details, a common theme emerged. The category genderqueer is not reducible to a group of persons who are perceived in a particular way. One interviewee, Rowan Keeney, put this quite bluntly. "My expression and my socialization falls on the femme side, but being non-binary is not about what is perceived of me. Non-binary is the liberation from the need to make myself smaller to fit into preconceived ideas of who and what I am." Keeney's point is independently reiterated by other genderqueer persons who express that there is no one way to be non-binary, that names, pronouns, and presentation does not define a non-binary individual's gender, and that genderqueers have all types of gender presentations, identify as feminine and masculine to different degrees, and don't need to look or act or be a certain way to be non-binary. Susanna Weiss, a writer for Teen Vogue who identifies as both genderqueer and a woman, is particularly explicit on this point. "Many people seem to believe you need an androgynous style to be non-binary, creating the assumption that I and other non-binary people who wear women's clothes must be women, but you can't tell how someone identifies based on what they look like." These statements and many others suggest that genderqueer's extension reaches only to those who are perceived to fall outside of binary gender roles or to have an androgynous presentation. Complementing this point is a second observation, namely that the externalist approach would also overextend. Many individuals who do not identify as and would not be considered genderqueer either defy binary gender roles or maintain androgyny. Butch lesbians, queens, cross-dressing men and women, trans men and women who do not blend as cisgender, and the variety of men and women whose bodies and presentations are androgynous are but a few examples of this. Laurie Watson, examining shared experiences between gender non-conforming persons, trans and not, vividly captures this point. "Trans women and I share an especially acute problem. We both want our gender to be seen as a way of being a woman who doesn't have to offer up her bona fides to the world anytime someone is confused, perplexed, or unsettled when they perceive our gender and sex as incongruous or ambiguous." In short, genderqueers do not have a monopoly on being perceived as violating gender roles, much less on androgyny. Plenty of non-genderqueer men and women share this experience. While taking genderqueer as non-reducible to any particular social perceptions may seem initially odd, it comes into better focus when we take seriously that being genderqueer is not so much about rejecting femininity and masculinity de re, but rather rejecting them as concepts that are always appropriate for interpreting an individual's behavior or aesthetic. That is, according to genderqueer persons, being genderqueer need not be about refusing clothing, behavior, speech, or roles that typically would be read as feminine, masculine, or any combination of the two. Rather, it often concerns rejecting the binary at a conceptual level. That is, rejecting the idea that their way of being in the world always should be understood via the binary concepts of feminine and masculine. In an interview with Washington Post, 18-year-old Kelsey Beckham, who identifies as non-binary, states, "I don't want to be a girl wearing boys' clothes, nor do I want to be a girl who presents as a boy. I just want to be a person who is recognized as a person. That is how I am most comfortable. I'm just a person wearing people clothes." The bold assertion of being just a person wearing people clothes strikes as the heart of any attempt to analyze genderqueer solely in terms of external perceptions. Genderqueers differ widely with respect to their assigned sex, perceived sex, and whether or not they function within traditionally masculinized or feminized gender roles. If anything holds them in common with respect to gender presentation, it is only a general rejection of having their presentation interpreted through a binary lens, but I will get to this in section 4. An internalist approach. If looking only to external features will not provide an adequate analysis of genderqueer, what about looking to internal features? Perhaps an internalist approach, or an approach on which genderqueer is understood as a group of persons with particular psychological features, has more promise. In favor of this approach, it at least appears to align nicely with what is by far the most common popular definition of being genderqueer, as identifying as genderqueer. If we assume identification is best understood as a wholly internal feature, i.e., a psychological state that an individual can be in without any external manifestations, then an internalist approach to genderqueer would be on the right track. I'll propose in section 4 that we should prefer a different political model of genderqueer, but let's examine the merits of an internalist account. The first and most important question for an internalist approach to genderqueer is, what internal features are we referring to when we talk about gender identity? Since the concept of gender identity, and in particular genderqueer identity, is used to determine the extension of genderqueer, it is crucial to understand what genderqueer identity would amount to. What's more, as Jenkins points out, the most common folk definition of gender identity, a sense of oneself as a man, woman, or some other gender, does not appear promising. Jenkins writes, "Many people who use the language of gender identity hold the view that gender terms such as man and women ought to be understood in terms of gender identity. To be a woman is to identify as a woman or to have female gender identity. The combination of this view with the folk definition of gender identity gives rise to a circularity. Someone who asks what it means to say that a certain person has a female gender identity will be told that it means that the person has a sense of herself as a woman. But if the questioner then asks what a woman is, they will be told that a woman is a person with a female gender identity." Jenkins' point about women similarly applies to genderqueer. The combination of two popular notions, that being genderqueer is identifying as genderqueer and identifying as a genderqueer is being genderqueer, leaves us in a hopeless and unhelpful circularity. Whatever it means to identify as genderqueer, if indeed this is the basis for understanding the category genderqueer, must be something more substantive. Within analytic philosophy, a few internalist proposals have emerged with more substantive notions of gender identity. At first, this substantive internalism might seem to worryingly essentialize gender by pointing to a mysterious innate sense of one's own gender that exists independently of external social factors. But, in fact, philosophical accounts of gender identity avoid this worry. Gender identity on these accounts is internal, but is based on one's internal or subjective way of relating to society's gender norms, structures, and interpretive guides. One approach, defended by Jennifer McKittrick, someone's gender in a given context is determined by their behavioral dispositions, given how these behaviors, if manifested, would be socially interpreted. In a given context, McKittrick argues someone who is disposed to behave in ways that others would take to be indicative of a woman has a woman's gender identity, and so is a woman in that context. Like McKittrick, Jenkins' account of gender identity emphasizes an individual's relationship to external gender norms. Jenkins proposes a norm relevance account on which an individual's gender identity is determined by what gender-specific norms they experience as relevant to them. That is, for example, someone has a female gender identity and so is a woman on this account if they experience norms associated with women in their social context as relevant to them. Moreover, norm relevance can take on a variety of forms. A female gender identity for one person may amount to feeling like others should refer to her with feminine pronouns and a certain name, whereas for someone else, it may amount to having the sense that her physical features ought to be a certain way, e.g., ought to include a vulva and not a penis. Gender identities on both approaches have personal and social elements. They are personal insofar as they concern internal dispositions or senses of norm relevance, but social insofar as these dispositions or senses must relate to norms or behaviors that are externally, socially associated with a certain gender group. Both McKittrick's and Jenkins' approaches could be applied to genderqueer identity. In fact, Jenkins explicitly proposes one such application. Someone is genderqueer if they do not consider the norms socially associated with men, nor the norms socially associated with women to be relevant to them. To illustrate, Jenkins uses the example of a building that contains only men's and women's toilets. Someone who is non-binary because they do not consider the norms governing social spaces for either men or women as relevant to them may have all toilets marked as uncomfortable places fraught with stress and danger. The first thing to notice is that Jenkins' norm relevancy approach to male and female gender identity differs dramatically from the approach to non-binary gender identity. So long as someone considers some of the female-coded or male-coded norms to be relevant to them, they have a female or male gender identity. After all, the number of men and women who take all of the norms associated with men or women as relevant to them likely is few and far between. But notice that this feature is taken to immediately constrain the proposed definition of non-binary, or in my terms, genderqueer, identities. According to Jenkins, it cannot simply be the case that non-binary persons do not take some or even most of the binary coded norms as relevant to them. Rather, they must take none of these norms as relevant to them. Here, the definition begins to generate a serious worry. Genderqueers frequently maintain, if only out of necessity, a sense of what binary coded norms are relevant for them in spaces where there is no alternative to these norms. One initial place to see this is in the dual identities of some genderqueer persons. That is, those who do not exclusively identify as man or as a woman, but who claim both a genderqueer as well as male and or female identity. Testimony suggests that one common motivation for this dual identification is a recognition of the inescapability of binary norms. The gender norms applied by state and other persons impact one's ability to move through the world. In our current society, saturated in exclusive binary divisions, there is no possibility of never taking gender norms to be relevant to oneself. Public spaces such as toilets, locker rooms, legal institutions, social clubs, language, and marketing, to name but a few places, are heavily gendered, and gendered not only according to the binary, but in a way that leaves someone attempting to navigate these structures no choice but to pick a side. Moreover, because all or nearly all genderqueer persons were socialized as either men or women, and often are perceived as men or women, only self-applying to the norms of a person wearing people clothes is not possible. Genderqueers who wish to navigate the world at all, much less safely, have no option but to see binary norms as more or less relevant to them. Weiss captures this sentiment when explaining their decision to identify both as non-binary and as a woman. I personally identify as a non-binary woman. To me, this identity acknowledges both that I don't have an innate identification with any gender and that I've been socialized as a woman. Weiss is not alone. In the same article, they interview 24-year-old Ray Noble, who also identifies as non-binary and as a woman. According to Noble, this is to acknowledge that she loves her female-coded body, but doesn't always feel it accurately represents her. Similarly, Laurie Penny, a UK-based journalist, articulates having distinct but compatible reasons for identifying as genderqueer and as a woman. My identity is more complex than simply female or male, Penny writes, but I am a woman politically because that's how people see me and that's how the state treats me. Weiss's, Noble's, and Penny's testimonies speak to the inescapable relevance of gender norms. At this point, someone might protest that genderqueer identity is marked by a feeling of discomfort or authenticity with complying with these norms. But this dramatically overgenerates many non-genderqueer men or women who also feel discomfort and inauthenticity regarding the gender norms that they are socially coerced to obey. In addition to overgenerating, though, it also undergenerates. There is an additional reason why we should be skeptical of the idea that genderqueers do not take any gender norms to be relevant to themselves. Some people locate their genderqueer identity in their fluidity between different gender categories. More specifically, this testimony suggests that some genderqueer individuals experience various gender-specific norms as relevant or apt in different contexts. For example, in Gallupo et al.'s study of genderqueer persons, many participants describe their gender in ways that include but are not bound by only one of the binary options. My gender changes. Sometimes I am a female, sometimes I am a boy, sometimes I am both, and sometimes I am neither. Sometimes I feel like I am completely a man, sometimes I feel like I am mostly a man, with some women agender mixed in. I can switch in between a variety of genders, man, woman, androgyny, agender, third gender, polygender, etc., day by day. In short, genderqueer persons sometimes do identify as women and or men in Jenkins' sense. In fact, Gallupo et al. Explicitly observed that genderqueer participants' gender identities could not be discretely conceptualized as male, female, neither, or both. While Jenkins takes the neither approach, then, this way of thinking does not align with genderqueer individuals' description of their own internal states. Setting aside a norm relevancy approach to gender identity, then, what about a dispositional approach? Why not think that being genderqueer is less about what norms one considers relevant to oneself but rather about what one is internally disposed to do, e.g., use gender-neutral pronouns, assert I am genderqueer, and so on. Such an approach might amount to something along the following lines. S is genderqueer in a context C if S is sufficiently disposed to behave in C in ways that would, in trans-friendly contexts, mark S as genderqueer. What might the behaviors be? On what interpretation, the relevant behaviors for being genderqueer would be different in content, but not in kind from those for being men and women. That is, the behavioral dispositions relevant to being genderqueer would include dispositions towards things like modes of dress, posture and mannerisms, productive and leisure time activities, styles of communication, and social interaction. But, as we already saw in section 3.1, no such external behaviors decidedly mark someone as genderqueer. Given this, the scope of relevant behaviors is significantly constrained. In fact, it seems that the only behaviors that would decidedly mark someone as genderqueer in a trans-friendly context is them sincerely saying so. On this account, then, someone is genderqueer so long as they are sufficiently disposed to assert that they do not exclusively identify as a man or a woman, e.g., I am genderqueer, I am non-binary, I am gender fluid. Here, two further worries arise. The first concerns the manifestation conditions for these dispositions. I suspect that much of the motivation for adopting a dispositionalist account of genderqueer identity is gaining the ability to count persons as genderqueer even when these dispositions are masked or counteracted by social costs such as the threat of bullying, discrimination, being fired, assaulted, or simply misunderstood. Rather than seeing someone as genderqueer only in contexts where they in fact say so, a dispositionalist approach would allow us to count as genderqueer anyone who would, under certain conditions, assert that they are genderqueer. Someone who is prevented from openly asserting a genderqueer identity due to social costs, then, can still be genderqueer. Given this, the thought goes, we should privilege how that person would be, were it less or not at all socially costly to be genderqueer. From here, we arrive at the idea that someone is genderqueer just in case, were the social cost sufficiently low, they would assert that they do not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. But what are these conditions? If they are ones where some social costs remain, then it would seem to prevent those with low risk tolerance from being genderqueer. Some people who might be willing to assert a genderqueer identity under no social costs might be unwilling to do so even in the face of small or infrequent costs. So leaving any social costs in the manifestation conditions means that only some people, but not others, can have a genderqueer identity. Suppose, then, the manifestation conditions are ones with no social costs. First, it seems likely that, in such a scenario, many persons who currently and comfortably identify exclusively within the binary might begin to assert other non-binary identities. That is, if being non-binary were completely socially accepted, such that no difficulties or prejudices faced those resisting binary categorization, why think that those who, under actual conditions, do not consider themselves non-binary would continue to do so? Regardless of which way we go, then, it seems this view gets the extension of genderqueer wrong even by its own lights. It will either exclude those with low risk tolerance or extend the category to persons who in fact take themselves to have a binary identity, but who might think otherwise in lieu of social repercussions. The second, I think even more important worry for this dispositional account is that it metaphysically trivializes being genderqueer. Regardless of the manifestation conditions for a dispositional count, we've seen that the most plausible behaviors that, when manifested, would be socially considered determinative of being genderqueer are assertions that one is genderqueer. But in that case, being genderqueer amounts to nothing more than a linguistic construction. There is nothing substantively different between someone who is and someone who is not genderqueer. The only difference is that one, but not the other, is disposed to use certain terms to describe themselves. On this dispositional account, no difference other than this is necessary or sufficient for being genderqueer. It is hard to see for this reason what the content of such terms might be, or what the difference between sincere and non-sincere assertion of identity might amount to. Genderqueer, non-binary, agender, etc. seem reduced to empty, or at least opaque, labels. It may turn out in the end that genderqueer identity amounts to nothing more than self-describing using certain terms, but if possible we should, and I think can, do better. To that end, I will now turn to a new proposal, genderqueer as a critical gender kind. Four, a new approach, critical gender kinds. What explains being genderqueer? Is asserting one's preferred gender label sufficient? Is it necessary? Is gender nonconformity or androgyny sufficient, even if not necessary? These questions are complicated by the fact that, as we've seen, purely external factors are insufficient for understanding genderqueer, and appealing instead to gender identity only pushes us to ask what might constitute a genderqueer identity. While it is tempting to think of this identity in terms of wholly internal features, such as a sense of norm relevance or a disposition to assert an identity claim, we've seen why these approaches fall short. So what could the difference between genderqueer and non-genderqueer persons amount to? The solution I suggest lies in understanding the category genderqueer not in terms of external or internal features, but rather in terms of political features, in particular features that combine both external and internal components. I suggest that genderqueer is best understood as a category whose members collectively resist the assumption that men and women are discrete, exclusive, and exhaustive gender categories, and where this resistance arises from the members' felt or desired gender categorization outside this exclusive and exhaustive binary. Importantly, I do not assume that each member of genderqueer must or will successfully resist this assumption, or even do so in a way that is intelligible to others. For an individual to be genderqueer, in my view, only requires that they take part in such resistance. While I say more about this below, I will not try to give precise conditions for what this taking part requires. In part, this is because I think there are no such precise conditions, certainly are not context-independent conditions. Primarily, though, it is because my central target for analysis is the kind genderqueer and not the individual property being genderqueer. Although it is common to conflate these projects, indeed they are treated as one within existing externalist and internalist modes of gender categories, I think to do so is a mistake. It is already recognized that explanatory individualism, or the idea that explanation for social kind or phenomenon reduces to facts about individuals, is typically not an apt way to approach social ontology. Just as an analysis of Christianity would be different than an analysis of what it takes for an individual to be Christian, so too an analysis of genderqueer is distinct from, though of course intimately related to, an analysis of what it takes for an individual to be genderqueer. To the extent I'm interested in individuals, it is in service of understanding how, as a collective, these individuals resist the gender binary. What is the best way to understand a gender kind of this sort? I propose that, to do so, we must recognize a new type of gender kind, a critical gender kind. Critical gender kinds. For any gender kind X, X is a critical gender kind relative to a given society if X's members collectively resist the dominant gender ideology in that society. Note that this definition leaves open the motivation or cause for collective resistance to dominant gender ideology. I take it that this resistance can be motivated or caused in many ways. For our current purpose of analyzing genderqueer, I want to specifically highlight at least two importantly distinct but compatible motivations: principled resistance and existential resistance. We can understand these as follows. Principled resistance. Principled resistance to dominant gender ideology is resistance that stems from or otherwise expresses individuals' social or political commitments regarding gendered norms, practices, and structures. Existential resistance. Existential resistance to dominant gender ideology is resistance that stems from or otherwise expresses individuals' felt or desired gender role and/or categorization. Principled resistance is a common practice shared among a variety of activists, allies, and members of gender and sexual minority groups. For example, whenever someone speaks out against sexist, transphobic, or heteronormative practices and does so from their commitment to gender or sexual equality, this person enacts principled resistance to dominant gender ideology. Attending Take Back the Night or gay pride marches, voting for politicians who support trans rights, donating to organizations that advocate for women's reproductive rights, using gender-neutral pronouns, or having a gender non-conforming aesthetic are just a few examples of resistant behaviors that are open to everyone. Many engage in these behaviors not only because of their own felt or desired gender role or position, but also because they have values and beliefs that commit them to resist dominant gender norms, practices, and structures. These persons are, in my view, jointly engaged in principled resistance to dominant gender ideology. More can and should be said about principled resistance, but because my account of genderqueer relies on the notion of existential resistance, I've described that phenomenon of principled resistance primarily for the purpose of contrast. Unlike its sibling, existential resistance stems from one's felt or desired place within gender roles or categories. Typically a role or categorization that is deviant given the practices, norms, and structures that arise from and sustain dominant gender ideology. To more sharply distinguish between these modes of resistance, suppose you meet two persons who use gender-neutral pronouns, they, them. One does not consider themselves non-binary in any sense, but uses these pronouns because they are committed to making English more hospitable for non-binary persons. The other uses these pronouns because they consider themselves genderqueer, and so take both she and he to misdescribe their sense of their own gender. In this case, it may be that both persons manifest principled resistance to the dominant belief that everyone is either a man or a woman, but only the second person manifests existential resistance to this belief, and this is because the second, but not the first, engages in resistant behavior. Here, the use of gender-neutral pronouns, due to their felt or desired categorization outside the gender binary. In line with this example, I propose that the key mark of existential resistance is the source of resistance, namely subjectively felt or desired gender role or categorization. The distinction between principled and existential resistance helps us articulate the difference between allies and members of gender kinds, such as genderqueer and trans. While both resist dominant gender ideology, members of these kinds resist, at least in part, because they perceive or feel themselves to have or desire to have a gender categorization that deviates from dominant expectations and assumptions. That is, who they take or desire themselves to be is in itself incompatible with or otherwise does not conform to the categorization imposed on them by dominant gender ideology. Importantly, though, this is not a purely internalistic notion of genderqueer. An internal relationship to gender categories is only one piece of the characterization. Collective resistance by those who experience this relationship is also required. Moreover, by including desired alongside felt, I hope to capture a broader range of the phenomenological states with respect to gender categorization than those emphasized by Jenkins and McKittrick. This desire could be based on political or perhaps religious motivations in addition to an internal sense of gender authenticity, relevance, belonging, or dysphoria. To be clear, critical gender kinds are not the only gender kinds whose members stand in political relationships to dominant gender ideology. All gender kinds are political, and all persons stand in relationships both principled and existential to gender ideology. When these reactions affirm dominant ideology, we can describe those who manifest them as belonging to non-critical gender kinds. Non-critical gender kinds. For any gender kind X, X is a non-critical gender kind relative to a given society if X's members collectively reinforce the dominant gender ideology in that society. As above, we can divide a reinforcement into both principled and existential modes. Someone who considers themselves a man on this basis enacts a hegemony masculinity relational to his class, race, etc., manifests existential reinforcement of the dominant assumption that men ought to behave in stereotypically masculine ways. In contrast, someone who considers themselves a woman but uses slurs to describe gay or effeminate men and does so on the basis of beliefs about how men ought to behave manifests principled reinforcement of this dominant assumption. To be clear, a single individual can belong to both critical and non-critical gender kinds. The critical-non-critical distinction is not intended as another binary into which individuals can be exclusively sorted. In fact, I suspect it is unavoidable to belong to both types of kinds. We all belong to a variety of political gender kinds, critical and non-critical, as well as externalist and internalist gender kinds. My focus here is on genderqueer as a particular critical gender kind, but my account does not preclude that members of genderqueer simultaneously belong to many more gender kinds. Of course, saying that genderqueer is a critical gender kind is nowhere near the level of specificity needed to understand this kind. Even once we narrow our scope to so-called Western societies, we find that there are many critical gender kinds, and they can be identified to various degrees of specificity relative to how fine-grained one describes an aspect of the dominant gender ideology. To draw this out and further motivate thinking of genderqueer as a critical gender kind, let's consider the gender ideology that dominates in Western societies. Broadly speaking, a vast number of social groups resist this ideology. To name but a name, trans men, trans women, abortion rights activists, Dutch dykes, drag queens, genderqueers, stay-at-home dads, female powerlifters, tomboys, polyamorous persons, and on and on. That is, in both principled and existential ways, among others, multiple groups resist normative, gendered, social expectations regarding their bodies, presentations, and gender roles, and other ways of being. On one way of thinking about critical gender kinds, then, all of these various and sundry groups might be classified together within one kind. Western gender defiers. Western gender defiers is a critical gender kind whose members collectively resist dominant gender ideology in Western societies. In at least two ways, this definition is not particularly illuminating. First, how might one go about deciding who does or does not count as a gender defier without a more detailed analysis of what composes the dominant gender ideology in question? Second, with respect to genderqueer, if genderqueers make up but one piece of gender defiers, this does not eliminate what is unique to genderqueer. It seems that in order to give an analysis of genderqueer, we need a better idea of what aspect of dominant gender ideology genderqueers resist, as well as how they do so. All in all, more details are needed. To this end, I propose a more, but still not very fine-grained, tripartite picture of Western dominant gender ideology. On this picture, the ideology can be thought of having three distinct but interconnected and mutually reinforcing axes: the genital assumption, the binary assumption, and the social assumption. While no one of these axes can fully be understood apart from the others, for sake of analysis, we can somewhat artificially take each individually. There is a picture on the page where if you're listening to this video and not watching it, you can pause and look at it right now. Again, there's a picture on the page if you're listening to this video instead of actually watching it. The genital assumption. Someone's gender is determined by their natal external genitalia. The binary assumption. The only possible genders are the binary, discrete, exclusive, and exhaustive kinds of men and women. The social assumption. Someone's gender determines what their hierarchical social role ought to be. More specifically, males ought to have masculine roles, females ought to have feminine roles, and feminine roles are inferior to masculine roles. All three axes together establish an ideology that exclusively divides bodies into two categories and establishes a self-perpetuating hierarchy between them, with persons whose bodies are sexed as male placed in a position of dominance over persons whose bodies are sexed as female. Within this framework, we could spell out a variety of non-exclusive critical gender kinds whose members enact existential or principled resistance to these axes. For example, those persons who claim categorization other than the gender that they were assigned based on their natal genitalia, a property I consider sufficient for being trans, manifest existential resistance to genital assumption. Similarly, anyone who considers themselves a butch lesbian, defying social expectations with respect to their gender presentation and sexuality, manifests existential resistance to the social assumption. I propose that genderqueer is best understood as a critical gender kind whose members collectively resist the assumption. More specifically, I propose that its members manifest existential resistance against the assumption that they must belong to one of two discrete, exhaustive, and exclusive gender kinds, men or women, that is, binary kinds that do not overlap, discrete, and account for all persons, exhaustive, and are such that one person cannot belong to both kinds, exclusive. Moreover, these members do so on the basis of a felt or desired gender categorization that is ontologically incompatible with this assumption. We can put this more formally as follows. Genderqueer is a critical gender kind such that its members have a felt or desired gender categorization that conflicts with the binary assumption, and on this basis enact collective existential resistance to the binary assumption. On this proposed understanding of genderqueers collectively and existentially resist the binary assumption. That is, this collective resistance is rooted in genderqueers' members' felt or desired gender classifications that they defy the binary assumption. This point is important because it demarcates genderqueer as a kind such that internal features, here personal relationship to gender categorization, as well as external features, here ideological Ideological resistance are required to adequately model this kind. This dualistic feature brings a number of important implications. First, it suggests that genderqueer cannot exist in contexts where persons are so bereft of access to gender-deviant presentations, concepts, and language that they are unable to perform speech, acts, and behaviors that would collectively resist the binary assumption. That is, I do not think genderqueer is adequately captured solely in terms of internal features, such as a dislike of being gendered within the binary or intentions to resist the binary assumption. Genderqueer is not merely a psychological phenomenon. For one thing, this would overextend genderqueer. No doubt many people who would not consider themselves or be considered genderqueer dislike being gendered within the binary, but have resigned themselves to it or otherwise accepted it as part of their lives. For another, this would remove the force of queer within genderqueer. If being genderqueer were simply in the head, a world functioning smoothly according to the binary assumption, with no material challenges to this binary, could very well be a world full of genderqueers. This to me seems like a reductio. Resistance to gender binary systems requires more than thought and effect. This point aligns with genderqueer's description of being non-binary as a way of rejecting such binary systems that lead to harmful stereotypes and oppression. In breaking down what it means to be a gendered person in the world, neither resistance nor breaking down others' assumptions occur merely within the head. Second, it suggests that genderqueer does not exist simply by virtue of there being a group of persons who adopt gender presentations, language, or behaviors that resist the binary assumption. As seen in section 3.1, external features are not sufficient for modeling genderqueer. Androgyny, use of gender-neutral pronouns, and so on are features that are not universal among genderqueers, and also are shared by many persons who identify within the binary. These features may well function to resist the binary assumption, even when manifested by binary identified persons, but for this reason, resistance alone is not sufficient to understand genderqueer. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, this dualistic analysis leaves space for variation across both the mental states accompanying felt or desired gender categorization outside of the binary, as well as the modes of resistance taken by genderqueer persons. The construction of binary gender kinds, men or women, as well as the latitude individuals have within them and how individuals are socialized into them vary dramatically across intersections with other social identities, such as race, class, and disability. For this reason, my model intentionally leaves open that within the group of genderqueer persons, one can, and I suspect will, find a vast range of concepts about and attitudes towards these binary kinds, as well as strategies for resisting binary categorization. What is central to genderqueer, I suggest, is found at the intersection of external and internal features. In particular, it is collective. Existential resistance to the practices and structures that arise from and reinforce the binary assumption. This resistance is multiply realizable. Again, there is no one, much less one right way to be genderqueer. Many forms of resistance are possible. Some common strategies will be familiar, using gender-neutral pronouns and other terms like the title MX, cultivating gender non-conforming aesthetics, asserting one's gender categorization, queering personal relationships, defying sexual binaries, and what I'll call space switching or moving between male and female gendered spaces. While again, no single one of these features is unique to or required in order to be genderqueer, they are familiar tools that genderqueers use to resist the idea that they themselves must comply with binary categorization. What they share, and what is, I think, a constraint on what can aptly be called resistance to dominant gender ideology, is that they violate what Kate Bornstein call the gender rules, the binary set of norms that are imposed and reinforced via social practices, material structures, and various forms of gender policing upon individuals according to the sexed interpretation of their bodies. Violating these rules challenges or defies dominant gender practices and structures As these practices and structures are many, so too are the possible modes of resistance, which we can expect to vary widely across intersectional contexts and individuals. To name but a few, gender-neutral pronouns communicating that one uses gender-neutral pronouns rather than a gender-specific pronoun. Gender non-conforming aesthetics, gender presentations that violate cultural gendered expectations, gender categorization assertions, articulating one's own sense of gender kind membership, queering personal relationships, fluidity between or violation of traditional gender roles within personal relationships, eschewing sexuality binaries, identifying one's sexuality outside of the gay, straight, or bisexual taxonomy, which is based on a binary gender system, space switching, fluidity between male and female coded material spaces. The list is by no means exhaustive of the many ways in which genderqueer people resist captivity within the gender binary. My purpose is not to provide an exhaustive list of the ways to be genderqueer, but rather illustrate the dappled and diverse nature of genderqueer resistance. While some of these modes of resistance will be more easily interpreted by others as resisting the binary assumption, others admit more ambiguity. Moreover, genderqueers will not use the same or perhaps any of these enactments at all times or spaces. Someone who uses gender-neutral pronouns with friends may not do so at work. Someone who will assert a genderqueer identity in explicitly trans-inclusive groups may not do so outside these groups. Genderqueers enact their identities in multiple ways because genderqueer does not present a new set of gender norms. It seeks to disrupt existing gender norms. That is, genderqueers are not aiming to maintain a gray androgynous middle ground between masculine and feminine, man and woman, but rather to resist the cultural command to accept these binary categories as the categories by which one must be identified, labeled, and evaluated. This point is further reinforced by qualitative empirical research on genderqueer identities. Bradford et al. Notes that while modes of gender typically expect gender to be stable and predictable, having the agency to make decisions regarding one's body and identity may be an integral component of genderqueer identity development, one that often results in a process of experimentation. Again, though, my focus is on the collective effects of this resistance rather than on the effect of any single individual's acts of resistance. Given this, there is plenty of room underneath the umbrella of genderqueer for a variety of resistance strategies, varying in type, clarity, and strength. In closing, I want to draw out two key upshots of the proposed view. First, the category genderqueer is not socially located. Because genderqueer on my proposal essentially involves existential resistance to the binary assumption as understood within Western gender ideology, it is largely constrained to contexts where Western gender ideology is dominant. This is because resistance, as I take it, connotates at a minimum a defiant reaction. However, this is not to ignore a closely related kind, one whose members challenge via resistance or not the binary assumption. Such a category would unify genderqueer with the variety of genders beyond male and female recognized in other societies, such as Indonesia's Waria, Native American Two-Spirit, and Samoan Fa'afine. In this, we have the tools for finding important similarities and points of solidarity between critical gender kinds in a given context with gender kinds across other contexts. We also thereby have a framework interpreting common claims to the tune of non-binary persons have always existed everywhere. If we interpret non-binary in such a claim as anyone whose social existence challenges the binary assumption, then we can look to any time or society to identify such persons. Alternatively, if we interpret it as concerning existential resistance to the binary assumption, then our search will be constrained to contexts where this assumption is dominant, pointing to important differences between genderqueer as here defined in categories such as warrior. In second, insofar as I have described genderqueer in terms of collective resistance to the binary assumption, one might worry that being genderqueer on my proposal requires that an individual must, to some extent and in some context, resist the binary assumption. No doubt, some will find this result unpalatable for reasons discussed in 3.2. Many people prefer to think of being genderqueer as something that can be wholly internal, such that someone could be entirely closeted and remain genderqueer. At the same time, these narratives are counterbalanced by other also common narratives, such as I finally get to be who I want to be, or I try to get to a place where I can safely be myself. One might worry that my account precludes those in hostile environments with heavy costs of defying gender rules from being genderqueer. In response, I first want to again emphasize that my project primarily concerns the category genderqueer and not the individual property of being genderqueer. It may well be that while the category essentially concerns political resistance, external resistance is not required of each and every member of this category. Consider, for analogy, the category LA Dodgers fans. Presumably, this category is only properly understood as a social phenomenon, a collective of people that support the Dodgers by attending games, buying merchandise, and so on. This, however, does not mean that in order for an individual to belong to this category, they must engage in socially perceived fan-like behaviors. Perhaps it is sufficient that they themselves are aware of their support for the Dodgers, even if they keep this a secret. To be honest, I myself am not convinced that internal states should be considered sufficient for being genderqueer. I tentatively suggest that this way out for those who demand that they must be. I myself lean toward the thought that some externalized resistance is required for being genderqueer, keeping in mind that resistance is multiply realizable and need not be successful. Indeed, there are a myriad ways that someone could manifest resistance to the gender binary without incurring heavy social costs, even in hostile environments. While pronoun pins, cultivating androgyny, or simply asserting one's identity are all clear ways of resisting the binary assumption, nothing so loud is required by my proposal, which emphasizes collective over individual resistance. As one agender person put this, sometimes when we dress ourselves or when we find moments of authenticity, they are acts of resistance even when they are small. My proposal leaves these small acts of resistance open to genderqueer persons and does not require social uptake of any given individual's acts of resistance, even if, given the political nature of this category, some degree of social uptake of its members' collective resistant actions is required for the category's existence. I agree that social costs nevertheless could prevent someone from resisting the binary in any way, despite felt or desired non-binary identification. However, I diverge from standard interpretations of this situation, which say that this person is truly genderqueer and unjustly prevented from self-expression. In contrast, I read the situation as one in which someone is unjustly prevented from being genderqueer, referring to closeted genderqueers rather than people who are unwillingly forced into binary classification, downplays both the power of social forces over our access to social identities, as well as how oppressive that power can be. Someone who is forced to follow all the gender rules out of fear is, by my lights, prevented by an unjust social system from being genderqueer. The cost of ideological resistance is untenable. This is not merely a stifling of self-expression, but a stifling of self-realization. If genderqueer is centrally about resistance to the binary assumption, oppressive social factors have the potential to prevent its realization. In contexts where someone wants to resist binary classification, but faces untenable costs of doing so, the central injustice is not, I think, a lack of recognition, rather it is a lack of freedom with respect to one's ability to resist gender classification. Emily Brehab, who identifies as intersex and non-binary, describes being caught in such a situation. Now that I live in Texas, I find it more difficult to walk the line of affirming my identity to myself while remaining safe. I find myself reverting to the mean, growing my hair long, letting it slide when people call me a woman. Is my identity even real if I don't express it? There is something incredibly powerful, revolutionary even, about challenging someone's understanding of gender with your very existence. Understanding genderqueer as a critical gender kind whose members collectively manifest existential resistance to the binary assumption helps us understand the experiences of persons like Brehab. Being genderqueer is not simply in the head, it challenges dominant gender ideology with one's very existence. To understand this gender kind, we needed a new model, one that captures the interplay between ideological resistance and gender identification. I've proposed one such model, and no doubt there are others, but if one thing is clear, it is that if we are to understand this cultural revolution, we need new concepts, new language, and new metaphysics. Armed with these tools, we can join Ricky Wilkins in wondering if we are unconsciously and finally treading towards the end of gender categories as we know them. Either way, I agree with Wilkins. It will be fun finding out.